I was standing in the hallway outside my own study, holding a glass of water I'd gotten up for at 2 in the morning, when I heard my wife's voice through the door, low and pleased with herself. "Just 3 more days," she said. "Then everything will be mine." I stopped breathing. I told myself I'd misheard her, but I hadn't. And in that moment, 34 years of marriage cracked down the middle like a windshield hit by a stone. My name is Daniel Whitfield. I'm 62 years old. For 28 years, I worked as a forensic accountant, first for a regional bank in Columbus, Ohio, and later running my own practice, Whitfield Forensic Associates, where companies hired me to find the money that other people were trying to hide. I know what a falsified ledger looks like. I know the smell of a forged signature before I even hold it up to the light. That skill, the one I built my whole career on, was about to become the only thing standing between me and losing everything my father built. That business, the one my wife was 3 days from taking, wasn't even mine originally. It was my father's. Walter Whitfield started Whitfield and Sons Furniture in 1961 with a single workshop behind a hardware store in Dayton, and by the time he handed it to me in 1994, it had grown into a company with 2 manufacturing plants and a name that meant something in 7 states. I'd run it as chairman since his death, even after I stepped back from day-to-day forensic work. It was never just furniture to me. It was every Saturday I'd spent as a boy sanding table legs next to my father, every lecture he gave me about honest work and honest numbers. 6 months before that night in the hallway, I'd had a heart attack. A bad one. 3 days in the ICU at Miami Valley Hospital, a stent, and a cardiologist named Dr. Priya Nair telling me I needed to slow down, delegate more, let my wife help carry the load. I did. I trusted her with access to accounts, with power of attorney paperwork, just in case, with more of my daily affairs than I'd ever handed anyone. My daughter Claire was 3 states away raising her own kids. I was recovering, grateful, and I see now completely unguarded. Evelyn and I had been married since 1992. I'd have told you up until that February night that I knew her better than I knew myself. She had been, for most of our marriage, warm and sharp and quick to laugh. Which is exactly why the voice I heard through that door didn't sound like her. It sounded like someone I'd never met, congratulating herself on a plan. I didn't confront her that night. I want to be honest about why. Part of it was fear. Part of it was 34 years of history telling me there had to be an explanation. But the accountant in me, the part of my brain that spent 3 decades finding buried numbers, was already awake. I went back to bed. I didn't sleep. And in the morning, I started paying attention the way I used to pay attention to a client's books when something didn't add up. The first thing I noticed was small. A folder that usually sat in the second drawer of my study desk, labeled W&S Trust, Estate Docs, was sitting slightly askew in the third drawer instead. I wouldn't have noticed if I hadn't organized that desk myself for 15 years. Then I noticed my laptop had been used. The browser history showed a visit to the website of a notary public office in Kettering I'd never used. Timestamped for a Tuesday when I'd been at a cardiology follow-up, and Evelyn had told me she was running errands. I called the notary's office myself, using my old forensic associate's letterhead out of habit, and asked if they had any documents on file under my name. The woman who answered, a notary named Denise Ruiz, told me after some hesitation that a Daniel Whitfield had come in on the 9th of February to notarize a durable power of attorney and a supplemental trust amendment. I hadn't been anywhere near Kettering that day. My cardiologist's office could confirm exactly where I was. Someone had stood in for me, or forged my signature well enough to fool a notary who didn't know me from anyone else walking in off the street. I pulled our joint account statements from Fifth Third Bank next, going back 4 months. That's when I found the real damage. 11 wire transfers, ranging from $4,200 to $38,500, moving out of the W&S Trust operating account into something called Larkspur Holdings, LLC. I'd never heard of Larkspur Holdings. When I searched Ohio's business filings, I found it had been registered in November, 4 months earlier, listed with a single member, Evelyn R. Whitfield. In total, Larkspur Holdings had received $214,600 from accounts that belonged, on paper, to a trust my father had set up to protect the company from exactly this kind of bleeding. And there was more coming. Whitfield and Sons had an offer on the table. A private equity group out of Columbus, Halbrook Capital Partners, wanted to acquire 80% of the company for $4.2 million. The closing was scheduled for February 26th. 3 days after the night, I overheard her on the phone. If the power of attorney and trust amendment Evelyn had forged were accepted as valid, she would have signing authority over my shares. She wouldn't need my consent. She wouldn't need me at all. I didn't tell her what I knew. I couldn't yet, I didn't have enough, and I didn't trust myself not to fall apart in front of her. Instead, I called the one person I knew could tell me if I was seeing ghosts or seeing the truth, Frank Delgado. Frank and I had known each other since 1988, when he was still with the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit in Cincinnati, and I was a junior forensic accountant feeding his team information on a savings and loan fraud case. He'd retired in 2015, but he still consulted, and he still had the instincts of a man who'd spent 30 years listening to people lie to his face. I laid it all out for him on his back porch, over coffee neither of us drank. He read the bank statements twice. He asked to see the notary log. When I finished, he set his mug down and said, "Daniel, I want you to understand something. This isn't a misunderstanding you can talk your way out of over dinner. This is a documented pattern. Forged notarization, shell company, structured transfers under reporting thresholds. That's not a spouse making a mistake. That's a plan." He gave me one rule, and he repeated it twice to make sure it stuck. Act normal, don't confront her, not yet. The moment she knows you're onto her, she moves the money somewhere we can't follow it, or she gets that closing pushed through before we're ready. We need 3 things: proof of the forged signature, proof of intent, and eyes on the closing before it happens. Can you do that? I told him I could. I didn't know, honestly, if I could. The next 19 days were the hardest of my marriage, harder even than the ICU. I sat across from Evelyn at dinner and asked about her sister's hip surgery. I let her adjust my pillows when my chest ached at night. I watched her hand me my heart medication every morning at 8 o'clock, the same as she had for 6 months, and I swallowed both the pill and the truth. There was one night, the 12th of February, when she asked me, almost gently, whether I'd given any more thought to letting Halbrook Capital handle all the paperwork side of the closing. "So you don't have to stress your heart over it?" I told her that sounded reasonable. She smiled at me the way she'd smiled at me for 30 years, and I went to the bathroom afterward and sat on the edge of the tub until my hands stopped shaking. Frank, meanwhile, was building the case properly. He connected me with a document examiner named Sylvia Ockaffer, who compared the signature on the power of attorney to 12 verified samples of mine and concluded, in a signed report, that the signature showed inconsistent pressure patterns and letter formation inconsistent with genuine authorship, high probability of forgery or tracing. Frank also tracked Larkspur Holdings to a registered agent service in Wilmington, Delaware, and from there to a second account, this one at a credit union in Beaver Creek, where $61,000 of the $214,600 had already been moved into a joint account under Evelyn's name and another name I didn't recognize, Gregory Paulson. I recognized the name eventually. Gregory Paulson was a real estate agent Evelyn had hired 2 years earlier to help us look at a lake house we never bought. Frank found 4 months of phone records showing calls between them, some lasting over an hour, clustered late at night. Then, on February 20th, 6 days before the closing, Frank forwarded me a text message he'd obtained through a subpoena tied to the fraud investigation he'd quietly opened with a contact still active at the Bureau. It was from Evelyn's phone to Gregory Paulson's, sent on January 30th. It read, "Doctor says his heart is weaker than he thinks. Once the POA clears the closing, I don't need him signing anything ever again. 3 more days after that, and Halbrook wires the rest. Then we're free." I read it 4 times before I could make my hands stop shaking enough to set the phone down. The plan Frank and I built after that was simple in shape, even if it wasn't simple to live through. We would let the closing date arrive. 2 nights before it, on February 24th, I would host a small family dinner. Nothing unusual, just Evelyn, myself, and my brother-in-law Thomas, who Evelyn trusted and who Frank had quietly briefed. In the middle of that dinner, with Sylvia Ockhaffer's report, the bank records, and the text message printed and sealed in an envelope on the table beside me, I would ask Evelyn in front of a witness exactly what she believed the power of attorney authorized her to do. She walked right into it. Over pot roast in our own dining room. She told me with the easy confidence of someone who thought the hard part was already behind her, that she'd taken care of the details for the Halbrook closing. That all I needed to do was rest and let it happen, and that once it closed, she'd finally be able to breathe for the first time in years. She said it warmly. She said it like a woman doing her sick husband a kindness. I asked her what, exactly, she meant by taking care of the details, and she said the words that had been circling in my head for 19 days. Not knowing yet that I already had them recorded elsewhere, in her own handwriting on a phone she didn't know Frank had already documented. Just 3 more days, Daniel. Then everything will be mine. You don't have to worry about any of it anymore. I opened the envelope. I laid out Sylvia's report first, then the notary log, then the wire transfers to Larkspur Holdings, then the text message to Gregory Paulson in the same com. Procedural order I'd used 100 times across a career of proving what people didn't want proven. I didn't raise my voice. I don't think I raised it once. I said, Evelyn, this is a forensic accountant's report showing my signature was forged on this power of attorney. This is $214,600 moved out of my father's trust into a company you registered in your name alone. And this is a message you sent Gregory Paulson on January 30th, describing your plan to take control of my company using a fraudulent document. While I was recovering from a heart attack you knew about, she went white first. Then she said the plan wasn't what it looked like, that Gregory was just helping with paperwork, that the money was for both of us. Then, when none of that landed, she said what people in that position almost always say in one form or another. You don't understand what it's like, watching you get sicker, not knowing what happens to any of it if you die first. I was protecting us. Thomas sat frozen through the whole thing. He told me afterward he'd never seen a person's face change that fast. I called off the Halbrook closing myself the next morning, using the original, legitimate power of attorney documents I'd kept on file with my own attorney, Marjorie Lynn, long before Evelyn's forged version ever existed. Sylvia Ockhaffer's report and Frank's evidence went to the Greene County prosecutor's office within the week. Evelyn was charged in April with forgery, theft by deception, and fraud involving a vulnerable adult, the last charge carrying additional weight because of my documented heart condition. Gregory Paulson was charged as an accomplice for helping structure the transfers through Larkspur Holdings. Evelyn eventually accepted a plea agreement rather than face trial. She was sentenced to 18 months, with the judge, the Honorable Rosalind Petty, ordering full restitution of the $214,600 plus interest, and a permanent injunction barring her from any financial authority over Whitfield and Sons furniture or my personal accounts. Gregory Paulson received 3 years probation and lost his real estate license. The Halbrook Capital deal eventually closed 6 months later than planned, at $4.4 million instead of $4.2 million. Once Marjorie had cleaned up every fraudulent document and the buyers were satisfied the ownership was clear. My daughter Claire moved back to Ohio for a while to help me through the divorce, and through the strange, quiet grief of losing a marriage to something so much colder than infidelity. My grandchildren still ask sometimes why Grandma isn't at Thanksgiving. I tell them the truth in pieces small enough for them to carry. I sold the house Evelyn and I shared. I kept the company. I still go into the Dayton plant most Fridays, and I still walk the floor the way my father used to, checking joints and finishes with my hands the way he taught me. It's strange what your training prepares you for. I spent my whole career finding the lies hidden in other people's numbers. I never once imagined I'd have to use it to find the lie hiding in my own home. If there's anything I'd want someone else to take from this, it's this. Love is supposed to make you feel less alone with your own vulnerability, not more exposed to it. And evidence, in the end, doesn't care how long you've been married to someone. It only cares whether the numbers are true. Blood or a wedding ring can make you feel safe. But safety was never the ring's job. It was always the truth's.